First meeting of the study that was ordered pursuant to Standing Order 1082, that we undertake a study of the lack of housing availability on a linear basis for Canadian Armed Forces members and their families, and the challenges facing members and their families when they are required to move across the country. That the committee shall hold a minimum of 4 meetings for the duration of the study, and the committee report its findings and recommendations to the House. And so this is the first hour, first 2 hours actually. And we have with us Rob Chambers, Assistant Deputy Minister. Thank you for coming, sir. Brigadier General Virginia Tattersall. Thank you. And Serge Tremblay, General Manager, Infrastructure and Technical Services. I just want to clarify with the clerk, is it each 5 minutes or do we want to have 5 minutes?
There will be 2 that are 5 minutes and 1 that's slightly shorter.
Okay. Okay, you'll go in the order you wish to go. We'll start with Mr. Chambers.
Alors, merci beaucoup.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairperson, members of the committee. I am the ADM for Infrastructure and the Environment of the Canadian Armed Forces. And among other responsibilities, I'm responsible for what happens out on the ground and the infrastructure when it comes to defence in Canada.
Work closely with chief military personnel on issues involving the full range of accommodations that are available to CAF members and sometimes their families, which includes Crown housing, residential housing. Speaking of which, I also have the opportunity to work with the Canadian Forces Housing Agency, which is the special operating agency responsible for the day-to-day management of that Crown housing portfolio. As a special operating agency, CFHA, we call it, the Canadian Forces Housing Agency, has a little bit more flexibility and extra authorities compared to some other parts of the organization. From a management and governance perspective, they report into the defense team through my organization. I suspect my colleagues will be fielding most of your questions today, but if I can be of any help, obviously, I'm more than happy to do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chambers. Mr. Tremblay.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and committee members. Thank you for inviting the Canadian Forces Housing Agency to join you today. So my title is, my name is Serge Tremblay. My title is the General Manager of Infrastructure and Technical Services. Just to elaborate, I am a part of the Canadian Forces Housing Agency. The agency's purpose is twofold. We support the quality of life of CAF members by supporting the housing services program. As well, as Mr. Chambers covered, we are responsible for the sustainable management of the actual infrastructure in support of the housing program, so the houses. Current demand for residential housing in D&D is high, and that is owing partially to the private sector's the private sector market conditions, which have increased the demand for housing for all Canadians, not just for our CAF members. CFHA has been working in lockstep with both Mr. Chambers' group as well as with Brigadier General Tattersall and her team, trying to find living accommodation solutions for the CAF members. It's a complex problem space that's characterizing Canada's current housing situation, and the answers have not been easy. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Major General Tattersall.
Bon après-midi, je suis le Brigadier Général.
Good afternoon. I'm Brigadier General Virginia Tattersall, the Director General Compensation and Benefits.
To speak to the concerns around housing for military members and their families. Affordability and availability of housing is a concern for all Canadians, and military members share the same concerns. However, those concerns can be multiplied when a military member is required to relocate for service reasons. In my role, I endeavour to provide both the means and support for Canadian Armed Forces members and their families in finding living accommodation that considers the needs of their personal circumstances, and to support the Canadian Forces Morale and Welfare Services in providing the community services and programs that members require. I also ensure that members are appropriately compensated for their work, which is performed under a wide range of conditions. That is why this past year, the Chief of the Defence Staff approved the remittance of rations and quarters to help members start their careers on a sure financial footing, particularly those who have not yet met their operationally functionally point, or in a simplified version, who are not yet completely trained. Moreover, the Department of National Defence and the Canadian Armed Forces implemented the Canadian Forces Housing Differential, a monthly payment designed specifically to assist those who need some financial assistance to secure suitable housing. In recognition of this significant change in the benefit, we also introduced the provisional post-living differential to bridge what members were receiving as the post-living differential and what they will now receive with a Canadian Forces Housing Differential. Canadian Armed Forces members also received an economic increase to better reflect the cost of living. While the economic increase, Canadian Forces Housing Differential, and provisional post-living differential are an important part of supporting our members and their families with the cost of living and affordability of housing, our work is not done. My team and I, in concert with the Associate Deputy Minister, Infrastructure and Environment, the Canadian Forces Housing Agency, and the Canadian Forces Morale and Welfare Services, are looking at how to better support members with the challenges of housing affordability and availability. Thank you for your time today, and I welcome your comments and questions.
Thank you. Ms. Cramp-Nyman, 6 minutes.
Thank you, and thank you for being here this afternoon. Minister Blair has suggested that there is a significant deficit of approximately 7,000 military housing units and noted that there is not enough resources to construct new units on Crown land. Yet the minister proceeds to let billions of dollars of the defense budget lapse year over year and make over $1 billion in cuts. General Eyre has suggested that housing is one of the top concerns for his troops. We clearly have a retention and recruiting crisis, and the housing chaos certainly doesn't help. So how can people be motivated to join and stay when the quality, the affordability, and the availability is so dismal?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. Perhaps if I could offer some initial remarks, and I'll turn to my colleagues. We can dig in on some of the detail there. I think it was noted in the opening remarks that Canadian Forces members and their families are facing housing challenges alongside all Canadians. And so the struggles that all Canadians are experiencing, perhaps that you yourselves or that I myself am experiencing, are no different for them in certain respects. I think my colleague from Chief Military Personnel can speak a little bit more to the supports that are being provided to allow for the differences. The nature of the service is obviously different, and so there are supports in place to respond to that. From an investment perspective, investments are being made in new construction and new housing. I'll let Serge speak to that in a little bit more detail. But at the same time, it is a challenging time. There's no denying that, but that's the job that we have ahead of us here, and that's what we have to deliver on. So,
thank you. Maybe just to add, while Mr. Tremblay is going to answer that question as well, if he could speak to an ATIP that was filed with the department asking the following: provide a list outlining wait times for military housing at CAF bases and wings, limit to records produced since January 1st, 2022. Final drafts only. My concern is that only 2 bases were included, Esquimalt and Greenwood. So in addition to the other answer, why is it not standard practice for this government to regularly be tracking the housing numbers and shortages on our bases? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I am unaware, so I will unfortunately have to get back to you on the details for that particular ATIP. I'm not familiar with the details. I will tell you that it is standard practice for us to track wait times regularly on an operational basis, but we don't historically keep records over time as far as it's serving the purposes of our operations. It helps.
Maybe sorry to interrupt you, but just with that specific comment, as of the 16th of October 2023, there was approximately 4,500 CAF members on the CFHA waitlist for military housing. To your knowledge, has this number decreased at all over the past month and a half?
Could you please repeat? Sorry.
Certainly.
If I
The
could
16th of October,
Yep.
2023, 4,500 CAF members were on the CFHA waitlist.
Right. Right. So I'd like to begin by elaborating that our wait lists are divided into two different groups. There's a priority 1 wait list and there's a priority 2 wait list. Priority 1 are for regular force members and regular force members who are moving at the cost of Crown to go to a new location, who have yet to find a new house in their new location. The priority 2 wait list are for people who are already in that location, have a solution in hand, but would like to change their situation and moved into Crown housing. So while the number remains 1,500, I would focus on the priority 1 wait list, which was those people who are looking for houses. At this moment in time, the priority 1 wait list is 1,398 applicants as of the 26th of October of this year.
Thank you. Further, though there is aid going to service members who can't sell their houses, what aid is being given to individuals who cannot?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. So that's perhaps one difficult to unpack in a very short time, but essentially there are 2 pieces that we provide to members in terms of support. The first is while you have your house listed, if you decide that you're going to relocate and sell your house and you're maintaining a residence in another location, there's a period of time during which we provide an allowance called a temporary dual residence allowance, which offsets the cost that you're not trying to carry both a mortgage at one place as well as pay for another. The second that comes into play is the fact that if you decide not to sell your house, then there is also a benefit that we will provide you. We call it a real estate incentive, acknowledging that you're actually saving us money by not selling a house because we're not having to pay the costs for legal and real estate. The third one is the fact that if you do sell your house and there is you come into a situation where you are selling at a loss, there is home equity assistance, which will reimburse up to $30,000 for that loss that you have sustained. So all of those measures are all endeavored to try and minimize the impact that members might experience in what is obviously a significant transaction for them.
Thank you, Brigadier General. Given Minister Blair's comments on the committee that with regards to your opening comments about the housing differential, can you speak to the expected timeline for full implementation?
So the Canadian Forces housing differential was fully implemented as of the 1st of July. What we were not able to deliver as of the 1st of July was the programming for our pay system. That has now been completed, and we're delivering not only the Canadian Forces housing differential to members, but also the programming that allows us to deliver the provisional post-living differential to members. Again, the limiting factor was just that there wasn't the capacity to reprogram our pay system, given that this had a number of complexities to it.
Awesome. Thank you.
Colleagues, we have these witnesses for 2 hours, and I'm hoping to get through at least 3 rounds of questions. So I may be a little bit less harsh than I usually am. Mr. Fillmore, 6 minutes, please.
Thanks very much, Chair. And thank you to the panelists for coming in. And beyond that, thank you for your service, both in the civil and armed service. Brigadier General, this might be a question to start with you, but of course, anyone feel free to dish it off. This committee has heard that the armed forces are currently in a moment of difficulty with regards to recruitment. And I wonder if you've gathered any data or any observations that connects the difficulty with the recruitment to the prospect of the housing challenges being experienced in the CAF.
So I can't give you hard numbers in terms of connection between those 2 particular issues. But what I can respond to you is the fact that obviously in terms of that broader understanding of you join the Canadian Armed Forces. So what is it that is of value to you in joining the Canadian Armed Forces? What is the value proposition? And obviously housing is a consideration. We all need, particularly in Canada, to have a roof over our head. I'm sure that there are some that have given thought to, okay, well, what is the implication for me? But I can't give you hard numbers at this point.
Okay, thank you for that. I think it's safe to assume that we all understand that the cost of relocation can be very expensive if a member is transferred to another location. It's kind of like the rent reset. They might have move into a different rent reality. I think we also understand that the housing costs associated with housing family members, putting up a whole family and relocating them are high. I kind of want to just ask you to explore for us you mentioned the word remittance of expenses. It wasn't exactly what you said, but if you could unpack that a little bit. And then also, if there's time, if you could just talk to us a little bit about whether this cost of relocation and the cost of family residences is starting to have the armed forces think about changes to its relocation policy, the idea that members are expected to move regularly between postings.
Mr. Chair, thank you. Three very good questions, and I will endeavour to answer them in order. First and foremost, what I spoke to in terms of the ration and quarter remittance is that when you join the Canadian Armed Forces and as you are going through your preliminary training, so basic training in Saint-Jean, followed by then whatever occupational or trade training you need to undertake, during that entire time frame, if you are in our quarters and you are eating in our mess halls, you are neither paying for your room nor are you paying any costs for the food that you are provided. That is significant because, as you can imagine, that's probably putting back into those individuals' pockets over the span of a year approximately $10,000 in terms of costs that they wouldn't otherwise have. And those are our members that are making the lowest amount. So that has been, I think, one of the positive changes to address the challenges, particularly in attracting individuals, is offering them that to them. The second, in terms of, if I understand the question, about the costs of relocation. So just to perhaps explain to the committee that when Canadian Armed Forces members relocate, we actually have a very robust suite of benefits that we do provide to members. So all of the cost for relocating your household goods and effects, so packing it up into a van and moving it wherever that is paid for by the Crown. The Crown also pays for your real estate, your legal fee, your land transfer tax. We reimburse you for the costs of your lodging, your travel expenses, as well as provide meals for you throughout that time period once your one house is packed up. And while you're awaiting for your household goods and effects to be delivered, we pay for that. We also pay for the fact that you need to obviously do a house hunting trip. So we pay for those costs for you to be able to go to the location and spend a week, or if you want to extend. In addition to, as I mentioned, benefits such as the temporary dual residence and the home equity assistance or the real estate incentive. So for most members, those actual costs of the physical relocation are covered. In addition, we also provide a posting allowance to members, which, depending on your marital status, will either be a full month's pay or a half month's pay. The second, in terms of then about the whole piece around looking at relocation, it's not so much our relocation benefits, but it is looking at how we have traditionally managed our personnel in terms of meeting the Canadian Armed Forces requirements. At the end of the day, there are certain service imperatives where if we need someone to go overseas because we have a commitment to fill for NATO, that billet has to be filled. If there is a unit that needs a commanding officer or a chief warrant officer as the regimental sergeant major, then that will cause a relocation. But we are certainly looking at how frequently do we have to relocate members. I would say that largely, if you are in the Navy, you tend to actually stay located on whichever coast is your home port for a longer period of time than perhaps individuals who happen to be in support trades where that need is greatest. But we are looking overall at how can we minimize some of that churn, but understanding that as part of our proposition, we also need to incentivize members to be mobile so that they can get the experience and they can attain the training that is required so that you can have general officers, so that you can have senior NCOs to lead the Canadian Armed Forces. I hope that answers all of your questions in sort of the order that you asked. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Brigadier General.
Thank you, Mr. Pillmore. 6 minutes, Madame Normandin.
6 minutes, Madame Normandin. Thank you very much, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. It's much appreciated. It's going to give us an opportunity to dig in with some issues, but I have a couple of more specific issues, perhaps in a second round of questions to ask you. I'd like to start with the BGRS. Now, often this is a source of frustration for servicemen and women, but I did put a question on the order paper. How many claims for retroactive reimbursement were made since the last contract was signed with BGRS since 2016? Now, BGRS has processed 62,000 files, and there were a number of retroactive reimbursement claims. And I think that figure is quite impressive. And it puts a lot of pressure on these servicemen and women. We're talking about their relocation costs and other brokerage costs. So why is it that the number of retroactive requests for reimbursement are so high given the number that were previously approved? Mr. Chairperson, thank you very much for the question. If I could respond in English, if I may.
That question originated is that since we brought in the new contract in 2018, we last year went through a period of significant recovery of funds from members that had not occurred since we had brought in the contract for a number of reasons, the most significant being, of course, COVID, when we are limited in terms of what we could do. But let me explain that really that recovery comes about as a result of two reasons. La première, c'est le fait que quand les gens
The first is that when folks relocate, they're entitled to request advance funding.
because they think they will incur a certain expense that they would like in advance. And that advance could range, there's a way that we calculate, but that advance could range in the neighborhood of $30,000. We will give them that advance. That advance, however, is exactly that, which means that eventually that advance has to either be repaid or it has to be settled because the reason why you took the advance has been adjusted. You've provided the invoices to explain the expenses, and so effectively we reduce that advance down to zero. A large majority of those recoveries, that was the case, was that individuals took advances. They had not, pas fait l'action requise pour...
They didn't do what they were required to do when it comes to submitting a claim to reduce the advance.
And so we were catching up with that as part of our financial due diligence, we can't just let the money to continue to sit out there. La deuxième partie qu'on arrive, c'est...
Now, the second thing is that sometimes there are individuals who have not provided the receipts that are required for the expenditure claims they've submitted.
Individual will submit a claim for an expense that is neither covered by the policy nor for which they have sought that adjudication to give them. So there are situations where up front they may have presented a case that they were going to move 2 cars. When they go to settle their claim, they're now charging to move 3 cars. And so we will then have to adjust that. But in all cases, we certainly endeavor to make sure that when we recover funds, that there has been a thorough review done of the file, and what we're not recovering from individuals is monies that legitimately they should have. And the last piece I'll just ask, ma dernière réponse, puis je m'excuse.
The final part of my response, and I'm sorry I'm a bit long in my responding, but we often give people the opportunity to make their repayment.
The ability to repay it over a period of time, so that what we're not going to do is put someone in a case where they have to repay $30,000 in a month, and obviously they don't have $30,000 to pay back. J'espère que ça répond à votre question.
I hope that responds to your question. Question on BGRS. I asked also the following question. How many complaints were filed by servicemen and women about the way BGRS operates and its internal management? We haven't been able to get our hands on those figures. Apparently, we can get our hands on the number of complaints for compensation by the Canadian Armed Forces, but when it comes to the management of files by GRS, DND has no idea of the number of complaints. They have to manually go into the files and count them. Is that a shortcoming? Is that a defect that National Defence doesn't have a real sense of the fact of whether or not the servicemen or women are satisfied with the BGRS services? And what we're hearing is they're not. Response. Thank you for the question. It is true that we don't have the capabilities that I would like to have. in order to get our hands on that kind of data as to whether or not they're satisfied with the service.
We're in the process of retendering that particular contract, and the performance management and that ability to have a better ability to determine the level of service and satisfaction. We are working that into the contract so that we will have that information. But I would also just qualify that we do surveys of individuals to understand if they are happy with the service or not. It's difficult because people don't like to respond to surveys, right? We tend to get too many of them. They get survey fatigue, and they can sometimes feel like it's not going to change anything for them. So we are looking at ways that how can we better sort of get that pulse in terms of whether individuals are happy with the service or not. But I can certainly tell you that I am made aware when there are challenges with the service, and I certainly endeavor to try and resolve what the issues are.
Thank you, Madame Normandine. Ms. Matheson, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you to the witnesses today. So, Mr. Chambers, I'd like to ask you some questions. Back in September, I'd asked Deputy Minister Bill Matthews about an audit of the facilities maintenance services, which found that your team didn't have the ability to complete a value for money analysis on outsourcing and on different private for-profit contractors. So I think this is actually one of the base of the issue that we're trying to get into in this study and today. We've seen the stock of military housing decrease in recent years, and the backlog for maintenance requests balloon. Buildings are being left under-repaired until they are falling apart, and then they need to be demolished. For-profit contractors are doing the rush jobs without robust oversight instead of using the public servants that they used to serve Canadians in the armed forces. Now, I've heard a lot from Canadian Forces members about the systemic challenges within your department's service delivery, the tracking of contracts, the contracting authorities involved, and that feedback from service members on whether content within or with repairs are at the standards that they need to be. So I'd like to know, since that 2018 audit of contracting for facilities maintenance services, what is being done to fix that, to modernize your department?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the question, Mr. Chair. I could offer some general remarks in that regard. If I could, I would like to pass la parole to...
I'd like to hand the floor to Serge.
...to the housing situation and the quality control that's in place around the work that contractors would be doing in the houses specifically, if that's of interest, Mr. Chair.
By all means.
But in general terms, I mean, this is obviously an issue that we spend a fair bit of time talking about with our union colleagues. Of course, we're all interested in the same outcome, which is to make sure we have the infrastructure in place to support members of the Canadian Armed Forces and all the work that we ask them to do. So because we share that objective, we're able to come up with some arrangements, some understandings about how to talk about the assessment of facility maintenance contracts, for example. And again, Serge will be able to speak to this in more detail on the housing front. But for example, if we have a new facility, a very large facility coming online, we always take the time to do a business case analysis of how we want to maintain that building going forward. So is it in-house make more sense of civil servants doing the work, as I think you're describing? Is it through private contractors, or is it through some combination of the two? Currently, I would describe the organization overall, it's that sort of hybrid approach, that last approach, where some of the work is done in-house, some of the work is contracted out. And there are all sorts of reasons why we might partner with a private sector contractor. And I'm happy to go into those into more detail, but I'll stop there for now.
But specifically, it was found that the problems and the reason why, I mean, yes, you deal with a lot of older buildings, but part of the reason why they were falling into further disrepair was the lack of quality in terms of those for-profit contractors that were used as opposed to public servants. And that was one of the big points coming out of a lot of the criticisms, ultimately, that those for-profit contractors were potentially cutting costs or what have you to meet contracts, as opposed to having consistent public servants maintain a better quality for those buildings. So I wanted to know, since that audit showed that, what have you done to better that situation?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. We have certainly stepped back and taken a look at how we manage performance around contracts. So do we have the right contract inspectors in place, for example? Do we have people who are following up and making sure that the contractors have what they need in order to be able to do the work that we're asking them to do? And where there are performance issues, that we're following through with them and holding them accountable as we should.
And so actually, so it's my understanding that the department hired Deloitte, which is the largest benefactor of outsourcing by the federal government, to restructure how the department decides on that outsourcing and contracting, which I think there's an inherent conflict of interest there. But when you hire a contractor to decide on contracts, but there you go. But I would like to know as well, because the government hired Deloitte, can you table with this committee how much your department has paid out to Deloitte for this contract, what recommendations they gave your department, and what new contracts have been signed with Deloitte to follow up on those recommendations they provided?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, thank you for the question. We're of course happy to provide that information. I apologize, I don't have it with me today, but it's readily available, so we can make those arrangements. And I would just, on the point about the work that Deloitte did with the organization, because it was with the organization, they consulted staff, there were surveys, there were working groups. We've now taken those recommendations, and we're actually using an in-house team of employees to help generate the next steps on that. So we're going to take these recommendations. Now we have to translate that into measures that are meaningful to us and meaningful to the staff, and that's actually going to be a grassroots-driven process. In fact, we just had a meeting with union colleagues just a couple of weeks ago. We were discussing the process around that, and I would say, while I wouldn't pretend to speak on their behalf, we've made a point of being very transparent with them throughout this process, because we recognize that there are some sensitivities here for some of the reasons that you mentioned. But we're very, very committed to making sure that whatever comes of this, that employees are a part of that design process and a part of that implementation. It's, in fact, a critical part of the process, I would argue.
Thank you. That's in Mr. Brazan, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, witnesses, for joining us today. This is an important study because of its impact on retention and recruitment of our Canadian Armed Forces, which we know is at critical numbers, short 16,000 members as it stands right now. You talked about capitalization of the current housing stock. How much money is that, and over what period of time? In your opening comments.
The recap.
I think you said in your opening comments.
All right, thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. So currently, we have a baseline funding allocation of $40 million for our recapitalization of our current portfolio. So this is the money that we need to basically keep the plane in flight, as it were, if I was to use that.
Okay, so that's all you got is $40 million.
No, this is the baseline funding that the department has allocated to us.
Okay, so let me ask this then, because we know over the past several years, over $10 billion in the national defense budget has been lapsed. How much money has lapsed from the Canadian Forces Housing Agency? That's gone unspent.
For the capital programming over the
Yes.
past few years, not very much. We tend to be very judicious in our application of how we.
Okay, so how many new units have been built then over the past year or two to address the shortfall that we have right now?
So for the past year or two, I can say in the 2022, we closed 20 RHUs across the country, residential housing units, and this year, if all goes well, we are expecting to close out at 18.
18?
18
Total.
total.
So are we talking barracks? Are we talking about PMQs?
So these are
talking about
RHUs, residential housing units. The capital funding that we do get goes both towards recapitalizing the existing portfolio of 11,600 units across the country, as well as trying to increase our
So less than 40 new homes have been built in the past 2 years.
That is
what you're
correct.
saying. So based upon the numbers that we've received through or questions on the order paper, the total as of May of this year was that Canadian Forces Housing Agency managed 11,543 homes. Does that sound about correct?
It is close.
Okay, and so I added 40 new homes because we do have the minister saying that we're 7,000 homes short. General Tattersall said in the news report in the Citizen back in October that we're short around 5,000 housing units at that time. You're only adding 40. based upon the numbers, we have in 2017, 1,569 homes that were rated in poor condition. In 2022, that number had increased to 2,148 homes in poor condition. That in itself is almost a 37% increase in the number of homes that are in poor condition and probably not habitable. So out of the total number of homes we have, just under 20% are in poor condition. So you're building 20 homes a year when we've got over 2,000 in inventory that are already in poor condition. Is there plans to replace them, renovate them, or are we just going to put everybody up in hotels?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. This question comes up regularly, so I would use an analogy. I'm a big fan of analogies to try to assist in understanding. So if I was to use a high school class, if there are a few students in that class, perhaps I'll correct some of the language that was used before I get into this. The member mentioned poor housing. We've actually qualified this housing as below average. And there is a distinct difference there for us. So going back to my analogy, in a classroom, if a certain number of students have a grade that is below average, it does not necessarily mean that those students are failing. So the 2,000 some odd units that you mentioned, and to quote the numbers, they are habitable, they are safe, and they can be occupied. We have 8 units across the country that are currently deemed to be non-occupiable. We're currently studying to determine whether or not we're going to decontaminate them or dispose of them. That is our normal process. So any house that we've got that is in a below average state, we have made sure that those assets, that house is habitable. If I'm faced with a problem where where the problem is great and we have to worry about either the safety of the asset or the occupants, I have the ability to turn off programming within the agency and reprogram some funding to deal with those assets directly. So we do not have any houses that are not habitable.
We got already 4,500 troops that are sitting, waiting for a home. We have somewhere between 5,000 or 7,000 homes required, according to General Tattersall in the press, and according to Minister Blair saying at the high end of 7,000. Does that number reflect just the current situation, or are we planning ahead when hopefully we can hit our target and fill all the empty positions in the Canadian Armed Forces?
Very briefly, please.
I would simply state that a waiting list of 1,389 people, which are the ones who are actually looking for homes, the full 4,500, as I mentioned, the priority 2 already have a housing solution. It's just not what they would prefer. But as far as people waiting to find a home, it is the list that we have on our waiting list does not necessarily mean that these people don't have a home. Oftentimes, people will put their name on our list when they get their posting message in early April, and then they will not move into their new location until between May and October. While their name is on our list, they're looking for additional solutions for their housing to house their families. Once they find that solution, they don't necessarily tell us whether or not they found that. So that number is, I would argue, a little high from a reality perspective, but it is not indicative of the number of people that are waiting.
We're going to have to leave that answer there. We're well over time. Madame Amropoulos, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. I appreciate the witnesses being here to answer our questions today. I have a limited knowledge in housing and the Canadian Armed Forces, so excuse me if some of the questions may not seem too advanced and they may be a little bit basic, but I'm hoping you can answer some of them. Given the fact that there is a shortage of about 7,000 units, and that obviously means that sometimes members have to go outside of the reserve of homes that may exist within your department, I imagine, right? So how often would you say that happens?
So, Mr. Chair, I'll jump in to provide at least the first part of the answer to that. The reality is that those that live on base are approximately only 20% of the overall Canadian Armed Forces population. Most Canadian Armed Forces members live off the base and rent from the economy, or actually buy a house, just like any other Canadian would.
Okay, so it's actually a smaller number that lives off of or that is using the units that are available and that you have. So when we say 7,000, we're just, what does that include exactly? If you can just maybe elaborate a little bit.
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. So to start off with, I would point out that the Canadian Forces Housing Agency housing stock is an option that is made available to the Canadian Forces members. It is not mandatory for them to attend, to occupy those houses. It's a personal choice on each individual's personal case. The 7,000 basically covers off. The department came up. Sorry, I will back up a little bit. The Auditor General conducted an audit in 2015 of the Department of National Defence housing program, and as a result of that, D&D identified its housing requirements should be respecting 7 principles, and the principles are what we use to derive those to derive that number of the 7,000 extra houses. I would point out that it was never the intent of the department, and I don't believe it still is, that we would be owning 7,000 houses. The intent was the requirement, not the departmental ownership. We know how many roofs we need to put over heads to make it a little clearer from our perspective. We don't have to own that, and so therefore we are looking to try to partner with local developers, with industry, to see if there's ways that if there's any opportunities for us to get into some form of a partnership in order to get those roofs that we want available in a faster way. But I would remind everybody that we are operating in the same environment as the rest of the Canadians who are also looking for houses, and it has been proven to be a bit challenging.
Thank you. So I imagine that all of the announcements that we have recently made in housing have really nothing to do with what you would have access to, correct?
I believe all the announcements that would have been made would have been, yes, they would be related to our housing because the program would be flowing through CFHA, but I would have to take a look at the time frame over which that money that we've been discussing has been provided. We have been operating to a 20-year program, depending on which way we've been answering the questions.
Okay, thank you. The witnesses also mentioned that there are a lot of things that are being done to help members find housing, but that given the market right now, it's been very difficult, just like all Canadians are in that same boat of having a difficult time finding housing. But you did mention that you're looking into potential alternative solutions and that you're open to them. I'm wondering if you can share with us anything that is in the docket, anything that has been considered that isn't already being done.
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. So we just recently concluded a call to industry at our 5 priority locations where we have the largest requirement, the gap between our existing portfolio and the requirement. We just recently got those requests for information back, and we haven't analyzed the final details in those. The overall flavoring is that much like I mentioned earlier, we're in an environment where housing is a challenge for everyone. So for people to look at partnerships with the Crown when they're still looking at ways to address municipal requirements for housing, it's been a challenge. So I will be more than happy to respond at a future date once we've had a chance to review the data. Legitimately, this study finished just a couple of weeks ago, and we haven't had time to crunch the data.
Okay, thank you very much.
2.5 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
2.5 minutes, Madame Normandin. Thank you very much. I'd like to come back to something that was mentioned in your opening remarks, the amounts that are provided when you sell your house at a loss, when you're relocated. I understand that it's a maximum of 30,000, but unless I'm mistaken, it's been 2.5, 3 years that the amount has been that 3,000, and it was a little more before that. Is that really jive with the reality of servicemen and women? There's an example of a CAF member who was in Cold Lake in 2014 and in the oil boom sold their house at an $80,000 loss because when you're relocated, oftentimes you have to turn on a dime. Is that amount really still representative of the needs of CAF members? Thank you for your question. Well, honestly, it depends on each individual and their situation as to whether 30,000 will be sufficient. Did they buy a house in a location where it will be easy to sell?
terms of what individuals choose to do and what they may choose to do to sell. But the $30,000 was the amount that, in conjunction certainly with the RCMP and the remainder of the public service, that was deemed to be equitable in terms of trying to address this. Specifically, however, to your question for Cold Lake, je suis bien au fait avec la situation.
I'm fully aware of the situation in Cold Lake, and we're working currently on a solution to address the hardship that those individuals experience with the sale of their house at loss.
Further details than that, because it is something that we don't yet have authority for. But believe me, I am very aware of that file, and we hope to be able to announce something within the next sort of 6 to 8 months. Thank you.
So these relocations mean there are a lot of costs are incurred, removalist costs, legal costs. Should we be minimising the number of forced relocations to reduce the costs incurred by CAF, or perhaps have financial incentives to relocate to less popular regions rather than forcing or obligating those relocations? Thank you for the question. We're working on that exact issue currently. Should we be providing another benefit to encourage CAF members to relocate to a location that isn't really that popular?
Many initiatives. Thank you.
Madame Madison, 2.5 minutes.
From what was stated before, I think by Mr. Tremblay, talking about trying to find all of these different ways to ensure that roofs are made available and thinking about that, I had previously asked the minister about the option to transfer the somewhat larger amounts of underdeveloped D&D property to not-for-profits, cooperatives, affordable housing, using non-market housing near those bases. Can you tell us if there has been analysis done on this, or and what that might suggest?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, thank you for the question. So we're working very closely with the Crown agency that's responsible for real estate and development within the federal family, so to speak, the Canada Lands Company. And it's been a very busy time for them. Obviously, there's a lot of activity on this front right now. So, yes, we are working very closely with CLC, we call it Canada Lands Company, to identify surplus properties that we have now that would lend themselves to housing and that are in markets where there's the greatest demand and there would be the greatest chance of a successful project. CLC, in turn, works with some of the organizations you just described, ma'am. So the answer is yes, we are doing that work right now.
Perfect. One of the folks that has reached out to me has had some issues in terms of that moving that we were talking about earlier and that Madame Normandin had been talking about. But in 2021, Mr. Sewell was medically released, but he had a surgery scheduled for shortly after his release, and he knew that he couldn't find a new family doctor to reschedule that surgery. It would have been so difficult, and to keep that in line with his first move. So he tried to delay his move until he had recovered after surgery, but then he was denied that compensation, and even years later he hasn't received it. So I'm sure that he is one of many who fall into that position. Can we talk about how flexible that access to those funds are, and if you're working on any ways to compensate those who have missed out because of the lack of medical positions that we have and doctors that we have in order to serve our armed forces?
Question. If I understand the context of the individual, because obviously I can't recall all the names that may have potentially raised a question. So I believe what you're referring to is called an intended place of residence move. So when you have served a certain number of years, or if you are released medically, you have the entitlement to relocate to a location that is your choice. That benefit is 2 years, so everyone has extended that benefit for 2 years. If within that 2-year time frame, you realize that there is a reason why you may not be able to complete that move, and there are very specific criteria. Medical is one of those that we would consider. Then you can request of my organization to have a 1-year extension. So that would mean that once you've released, you now have 3 years. If you find that there are still implications, and a lot of times medical makes it extremely complicated, then you can request us to approve another 3 years. That is at chief military personnel level. So that in total means that an individual would have almost 6 years as a time frame. But again, there's very specific criteria that we consider as to whether we would approve that or not for an extension. Thank you.
And Mr. Kelly, 5 minutes.
Thank you. I want to go back to some of the numbers here. I found your responses to Mr. Bazan kind of quite troubling. So $40 million is the budget for the entire capitalization of housing. That's correct? That's what you said, I think?
I did say we get $40 million a year baseline from the department.
Okay, so that's 11,000 units in total?
11,006 in a bit.
Okay, so that's 3,500 per unit.
Correct.
Per year.
That is correct.
So you have at least every year about 200 houses more are dropping into below average. Is that correct?
Over the course of the years of the pandemic, which is the years we're talking about, that would have been correct. But this year, our numbers are actually on the decrease,
Of the numbers that are in
going into below average condition.
Okay, can you, if you have to maintain all of these homes in their current condition, even just the current condition, on $40 million, that leaves you with what? Enough to build 20 houses a year? Is that correct?
So, thank you for the question. If I can contextualize, perhaps it might assist the discussion. Recapitalization for us is the money we get from the department to extend the life of the assets. The repairs, the condition, the planned maintenance for those assets are actually paid for not from the department, but they are generated from our revenue stream within the agency and pay for it internally. So we do control the degradation or the decrease in our condition assessment by focusing our investments from our revenues to deal with just that problem. So we do turn our revenue stream over back into the portfolio to keep it on track and to prevent it from degrading.
Okay, there was an information request. Ms. Kramp-Nyman asked you about it. In response to that ATIP, it was a lengthy response, many dozens of pages, yet only Esquimalt and Greenwood were referenced in that ATIP. Why?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. I repeat, I'm not aware of the details of that particular ATIP, so I...
Okay, you're aware that your department is required by law to answer questions that are put to it through access to information requests.
Yes, I am. I am just simply advising that I don't have the answers.
Okay, so could it possibly be that your department only knew the wait list information for those two bases, and you just simply don't even know how many are on the wait list for all the other bases?
Mr. Chair, I just feel we're at a bit of a disadvantage here because we don't have the ATIP request in front of us. We would be happy to provide you with waitlist information by site. We can do that. We don't have the information from the ATIP.
That would be very helpful if you could do that. It was a request that was made of your department. The Brookfield hack disrupted a number of CAF members' moves, and why did it take so long for that leak to become known publicly?
So, Mr. Chair, I don't think that I can respond as to why it was that we were not aware of the leak when it first occurred. That would be for CERVA and BGRS to provide that explanation. But I would like to clarify that moves continued throughout the entire time frame. Even during the period when the website was down, we were still able to provide members with the advance of funds that permitted them to be able to close on houses and be able to complete their moves. Thank you.
There have been complaints that that's not to the contrary, that have become that we have heard that transactions were affected and that people did not get their money, and that there were problems with houses closing, house transactions closing. What information was leaked in this hack?
Mr. Chair, thank you. That is not at this time fully known. As you are aware, this was not just CERVA and BGRS Canada. This was worldwide. The company is still working through the analysis in that regard, and we expect.
How many individuals were affected?
So again, Mr. Chair, I can't give you the total number because at this point that has not been fully validated either by the company or then by extension as we get the information to know that.
Okay, what steps have been taken to ensure that CAF members have their information protected?
So, Mr. Chair, a number of things. The website is back up with additional protective measures. We are looking at the contracting clauses so that as we go forward, we can ensure that we have a more robust requirement contractually to provide that protection.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. Mr. Fisher, 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you, folks, for being here today. We owe a huge debt of gratitude to Canada's military families. Military spouses, of course, support their loved ones in numerous ways when they're serving here or serving abroad. How are we currently supporting military spouses as they pick up their lives and relocate? You know, are we assisting with employment? Are there other things that we do for military spouses during a relocation?
So, Mr. Chair, thank you for the question. I'd like to expand on two elements of exactly what we're doing. The first would be the work that the Canadian Forces Morale and Welfare Service is doing to deliver a spousal employment program, which is already delivering success, and I'll give you two clear examples of that. They have conducted virtual career and networking fairs, 3 events this fall, for which we had 120 spouses attend, 14 employer partners, with a 71% follow-up with spouses to, in fact, engage in those discussions about potential employment. There was also a LinkedIn content creation session for which we had across those 2 sessions 30 attendees. And the intention is this later this year, in 2024, to offer online career counseling where we will offer a virtual career support for military spouses to support them. The other way that we support our families, because we are aware that medical care is often a challenge, again, through the Canadian Forces Morale and Welfare System, in concert with MAPLE, we have the Military Family Virtual Healthcare Program, which offers the ability for telehealth that permits members who may not yet have a family doctor to be able to access medical advice, attain prescriptions, lab or imaging requisitions. It's just one of the many ways that we are endeavoring to better support families in their relocation. Thank you for the question.
Excellent. Thank you very much. My riding of Dartmouth Coal Harbour is home to CFB Shearwater, and the Military Family Resource Centre is an incredible resource for military families. I remember back in 2018, we delivered new funding to modernize the Military Family Services Program and provide additional support to military families. I'm interested in your thoughts on just how important MFRCs are to ensuring that military families are supported, especially in relation to relocation.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. I am contrary. I don't work for Canadian Forces Morale and Welfare Services, but I will certainly acknowledge the valuable role that the Military Family Resource Centres do play, and certainly for CFMWS, our Morale and Welfare Services, they continue to look at the support they provide and how they can better support the MFRCs. I realize that doesn't necessarily give you the answer that you're looking for, but I also know well not to overpromise for CFMWS.
I appreciate that. When it comes to accessing military housing, are difficulties the same for men and women?
So, Mr. Chair, I think that's a difficult question for us to try and unpack. It's not something that we would specifically ask members because there's so many factors that would go into that. We tend to think that it might be a question of, do they have children? Are they required to then find a larger residence? Are there funding implications that they might not financially be able to afford it? I'm not sure that there is any greater difficulty for women that there is for men, but I will be honest that that is an opinion and that is not based on any facts.
Minister Blair had talked about phasing in the CFHD. Can you give us a little bit of maybe expand on the expected timeline for full implementation?
Yes, so thank you for the question. The Canadian Forces Housing Differential came into effect on the 1st of July of this year. At this point in time, we are still seeing members going through the application process to attain the benefit because they need to apply for it, but it is fully implemented in that if you qualify for it, then you will receive it. I think the piece that you may be referring to is the provisional post-living differential, which is the measure that bridges the gap between the previous benefit that existed and now this new benefit that we have created, and that will be over a 3-year timeline where every year we will reduce how much it is that we provide to offset that gap until, I believe it's the 1st of July 2026, if I have done my numbers correctly. That benefit will cease to exist, and at that point in time, the only benefit that Canadian Armed Forces members will receive for affordability will be the Canadian Forces Housing Differential.
Sure.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks.
Mr. Ruff, welcome back to the committee. 5 minutes.
Thanks for coming. Roughly 1,400, 1,390, 1,398 personnel on the Pri 1 list. Do you know which bases they're at primarily?
Thank you for the question. If I would rather, I can look through my notes and consume some time if you wish, but I can answer it perhaps a little bit later on. But yes, we do have the breakdown.
We're still roughly posting about 4,000 to 5,000 people per APS?
Actually, those numbers are around 8,000, but of that 8,000, that includes those that are completing their training and coming off of basic training, yes.
So, and it's hard to know what the exact locations. I know Mr. Tremblay is going to try to find the primary bases. Because to me, if you're talking 1,400 people on the primary list, we're posting another, let's say, Reg Force people that are, getting permanent, not going on a training. We're almost talking 25% that may or may not have the option of even getting access to a residential housing unit because they're just not available, right? They'd either go on the wait list or they got to find something else, just on the numbers as it escalates. Esquimalt seems to be one of the problem areas. With this new post-living differential or whatever it's the new name for it is, it stops after 7 years, if I understand it correctly. But as we mentioned, the Navy barely moves. And my concern is for those lower ranks. It's one thing because it is basically income tested, if I understand it correctly. But after 7 years, if you're a master seaman in Esquimalt making, I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, 60,000 a year, 70,000 a year, and you're living in one of these high-end markets with no housing that's available to you, you're living in a very expensive place, and all of a sudden after 7 years you lose that allowance that right now they continue to get under the current structure and that's being phased down. What options do they have?
Mr. Chair, thank you for the question. Perhaps to clarify on the 7 years. So this is a new methodology for the Canadian Forces Housing Differential to address the affordability of housing. And what we needed was to find a way to ensure that what we are delivering is actually going to address the need, which is the affordability. So the 7 years allows us right now to attain 5 years of data, so we're not even through to year 1. But by that 5 years to do an assessment, understand if we need to change the methodology, and then potentially by that year 7 decide that, okay, so the methodology doesn't work. But when you look at the numbers, within 7 years, many members in many locations will have been promoted. So while right now they may be making $77,000, because that is approximately what that lower rank will make on average, in 7 years' time, they're more likely to be making an amount that is over $80,000, because that is where the bulk of Canadian Armed Forces members, in fact, salaries sit. So it's not, while we say 7 years at this point, a lot can change between now and when we will reach that 7-year mark.
So, and that's good to hear that you're going to go back and look on this and base it on the data, although I can give you plenty of examples across at least the Army where we have career lower rank members that are essential to how the Canadian Armed Forces survive, and people that never leave whatever base they get posted to. And again, not even all bases have residential housing unit options. I represent Bruce Grey Sound that has Base Meaford in it. My understanding, looking at your latest annual report and my own knowledge of the base, there's zero options there. You got quarters for people going through training, but any of the permanent 400 or 500 staff that are military personnel posted there don't even have that option. I want to build off one of the questions that was asked earlier by, I think, Ms. Normandin about the $30,000 housing equity assistance program. That changed, what, about 5, 6, how many years ago? Because when the last time I was aware of it was 15,000 still, so it's nice to see that it's up to 30, but when did that change occur?
So, Mr. Chair, that change in policy came into effect, I believe it was 2018. And what it replaced was a far more difficult and onerous system that actually required the member to take on the onus for proving that it was a depressed market and therefore that there should be reimbursement for the losses. The $30,000 makes it much easier now for the member to only have to demonstrate that there has been a loss and then to be able to be reimbursed up to that maximum of the $30,000.
And I know in some of the case studies.
Thank you, Mr. Ruff. You've obviously been studying the techniques of some of your colleagues and expanding. Mr. Collins, 5 minutes, please.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Through you to the witnesses, I ask this question of whoever chooses to answer it. I'm concerned about the numbers as they relate to the number of units that are required, and we're all reading from the same documents. We all have access to parliamentary budgets. We all have access to the reports that have been prepared by the Auditor General. We're all using the same media accounts, and so we pull numbers from those documents. And I've heard just in sitting here in the meeting today, anywhere between 4,000 and 6,000 units are required. I've heard the number of 7,000 units required. And of course, there was the reference to the Auditor General report where that came from. And those numbers are used in public documents, and they're used in the media, and then they become the numbers. And it's there's a wide range there. And so, of course, the analysts are going to present a report to the committee. And I want to nail down, what that number is and what it represents from a transparency perspective. And just so when we're preparing a report and recommendations, we know with some certainty what that number is. And so I would ask through you, Mr. Chair, how do we drill down to get a number that truly represents how many units are required? Is it 4? Is it 5? Is it 6? Is it 7,000 units?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. I will clarify the number. People with rounding errors or depending on how it gets reported, it gets a little confused. The number was decided in 2018 by the Department of National Defense Living Accommodation Board, which is the authority for setting the requirement for the department. The number, and it was a range that was approved, was 17,000 to 19,000 RHUs across the country. This number was based on we derived that number based on the principles that the Chief of the Defense Staff issued for the justification of an operational requirement for the housing program for the CAF. And when we presented the numbers, the 17 to 19,000 was quoted. So you will start seeing 5.8 versus 7.2 as the range. That would have been because of what the portfolio was in 2018. So the 17,000 minus what we had as a portfolio, that was the gap to be breached or to be bridged. There was always an intent, and it remains the intent, that once the living accommodation policy, which was one of the other findings in the Auditor General's audit finding report, for the policy, once finalized, that we revalidate the housing requirement. We'll remind everybody, I'll remind the committee that the numbers we came up with were pre-pandemic. The world has changed, and we appreciate that we will have to revalidate what that requirement means. And we will be doing that. The policy is expected to be finalized by the end of this fiscal year, so by the end of March, at which point in time we will have 12 months, according to our remit to Parliament, to come up with a resource plan to bridge the gap, which means we would have to redefine what that gap is.
And so for the purposes of writing and preparing this report, Mr. Tremblay, what number do you suggest in that range of 4,000 to 7,000 that has been referenced just at today's committee meeting?
Thank you for the question. The requirement for the Canadian Armed Forces housing at this moment is 17 to 19,000.
Okay. And then can I ask, you said that, and this is your quote from today, it was never the intent of the agency to build 7,000 units. And that was in response, I think, to Mr. Bazan's question earlier. And you were very clear that I think that includes both a requirement from the agency and the units that you build on an annual basis, but also what you can seek to secure from the private sector for members who require housing or they're seeking from the private sector. Can you expand on that in terms of the split between when the agency hears questions like you heard today, and you go back to your team? What is your expectation? What does the organization intend to build, and what do you expect to secure from the private sector to meet that number if, in fact, resources are provided in whole or in part?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. At the time of the decision for the 17 to 19,000 RHUs, concurrent, I was in the room when the decision was made, or when the requirement was approved. Discussions surrounded how much of that portfolio needed to be owned and how much of it should be sought elsewhere. It was a philosophical discussion as far as it was difficult to decide how much we should own. I don't believe that we are still fixed to an actual number. However, we have been operating off of a concept to have about 1,300 units built over the course of 10 years based on the funding that we would be requesting from the department. I would caution the committee that CFHA doesn't build as we see fit. We try to build to match the department's requirements and as it can be resourced. So we try to optimize the capital funding we do get. As I mentioned earlier, we do try to do a balancing act between recapitalizing our portfolio of 11,600 units as well as build new. Last year, in the face of the crisis,
we're going to have to, leave the answer there. Thank you. Madame Normandine, 2.5 minutes, please.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. I have a more specific question regarding Saint-Jean that I represent and the lack of occupancy in some cases, and that sometimes helps to avoid relocations. But in my particular riding, we have the military college, but also the military base, the recruits college, and I know we have difficulty recruiting instructors for the recruits school. And the amount for Saint-Jean went from 1,700 to a higher amount for housing units, or a lower amount rather. So, and yet 20 minutes from Saint-Jean, those amounts went up. So I'd like to know if this is a well-known situation. This sends a bad message in my opinion, when it comes to recruiting instructors and those that want to join the Canadian Armed Forces. First question, are you aware of the situation? Thank you very much for the question. Yes, I'm well and truly aware of the situation, and I'm awaiting a decision from the Treasury Board regarding that particular situation. We've asked for an extension to allow individuals to keep their accommodation without having to make up for the previous rate and the rate that was approved in June. Thank you very much. But what about those people who are coming for the first time? I think the amount to find an apartment with internet, a garage, and so on and so forth went down to 1,150. And apparently there was a market study conducted to justify reducing that amount. Could we get a copy of that market study first? And second, I'd like to know if that market study was conducted in the case of all other municipalities that are subject to that particular provision, because in some cases the amounts have gone up. But Saint-Jean is one of the only places where that amount has gone down. So I just want to know if all of those municipalities were subject to a market study. Thank you very much for the question. Yes, I'm sure we'll be able to give you a copy of the report, which deals with all of the locations where people are affected.
But we can certainly provide you a copy.
Norman, 2.5 minutes. Ms. Masson.
I just wanted to quickly get back to the situation I was talking about with Mr. Sewell, in that you had been talking about the program for that covering of moving funds, but that program had actually changed. So, and that the person I was talking about actually got caught in a time before that change in policy. So, is there any sort of a reconsideration that could be attempted for people who have found themselves now out of luck because they just didn't happen to fall within the timelines before the changes were made to make that policy better?
Thank you for the question. No, there is no recourse to change what is the current policy. The current policy did not provide for a grandfather, so when the policy was approved for a change, it was whoever had a valid intended place of residence request in at that time, now moved into the new policy. Those that had already completed it, we can't go back and change that. So no, there is no recourse.
So those people are just out of luck, apparently, unfortunately, in a really harsh way. Okay, fair enough. One of the things that you had talked about, and I just wanted to get a better understanding, the exchange between you and Mr. Fisher as well was talking about these jobs for military family members, and we've been talking about that actually before in this committee. I'd asked the minister, and I think it was the deputy minister who answered. Ultimately, that's the non-public funds for employees that are covered for some of these military families. But unfortunately, they are not paid the same as basic minimum wages. Is that, and I've challenged numerous people who have run that program in this committee. Can you tell me whether or not that's been changed yet, so that they are in fact paid a minimum wage standard?
So, Mr. Chair, no, I cannot comment on your question because that is outside of Mylene's responsibility. Thank you.
Okay.
Malilio. 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. It's a pleasure to join the committee today, and thank.
The elite committee on the Hill.
Well, I'm getting that vibe. It's good to be here. I appreciate our witnesses as well for obviously a very important conversation here today. So I just want to note some information that we received from an ATIP. It was a briefing note that was dated the 5th of May, 2022, and it dealt with the presentation of 14 Wings' future housing requirements to the RCAF and on to the Living Accommodation Board. The conclusion states, a quote here, 14 Wing has an established requirement for an additional 34 housing units. This is on top of the planned builds for attrition. Both types of construction need to be advanced faster than the current 10-year timeline for new RHU construction. The type of RHU growth also needs to be tailored to the needs of 14 Wing personnel so that single members are not occupying units better suited for small families. That's the end of the quote there. And in the email chain for the above, it is indicated that at Greenwood, they are telling people they need to wait 2 to 8 months to prepare the unit for a new tenant when the old one leaves. So what would be the renovations? I would imagine they would be simple renovations that need to take place. What would it be the rationale for those renovations to take up to 8 months?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair, but I've got a little bit confused on the facts, and I'm not, again, unfortunately familiar with this particular ATIP. And if it was from 14 Wing,
Email from the department.
Yeah, it was an email from the department, so it's just referring to Greenwood. In Greenwood specifically, they're saying it to folks there that they need to wait 8 months to prepare the unit for a new tenant. So do you have any information on what would cause that 8-month delay in terms of what renovations would be needed?
So thank you. But I would have to get back to you and provide those details because off the top of my head, I do not, I cannot comment on a delay of that nature.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Would you be able to comment perhaps on what measures would be taken through the department to ensure that there are a faster turnaround time so that those types of renovations can be done more quickly?
Thank you for the question. Well, if it's for a simple, if it's for a March in, March out, which is a turnover of occupancy from one to the other, the turnover timing is not very challenging. I would conjecture that for a larger turnover of this nature, there's either a larger degree of intervention required in the house, or there's a problem. But again, I can't really respond directly for that particular question. But I will get back to you. I will get back to the committee as far as the lengthy preparation time quoted here.
Okay, I appreciate that, and yeah, any information, of course, that you're able to get back to us will be a help. I might not be sitting here the next time that information gets here, but I know my colleagues would certainly appreciate that. Just quickly, with some of the time I have, I'd like to talk about how this whole situation really impacts retention. So I think it was in Mr. Bazan's remarks, you noted the gap that we're seeing in terms of what needs in terms of people filling the positions that we have. I'm wondering if you could put that back on the record in terms of how many vacancies there are, how big that gap is.
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. I mentioned earlier the CDS's comments, the CDS's principles for to justify the housing program for D&D. One of those principles was unique military lifestyle, and I would call particular postings for senior members who have to get posted to a given location as part of that. So those numbers are integrated into the numbers that we were talking about. Depending on the nature of the position we were talking about, occasionally they do get attributed something we call a designated residence, which means that the individuals are given a specific address for that position when they get posted. And this is something that we maintain directly with the Chief of Military Personnel, and those can be requested directly as required.
And I don't think I have much more time. I just maybe quickly ask, do you have any comments on how folks who are unable to those who are unable to find adequate housing, people that are losing money, for those that are either already members of the armed forces or those that are interested in going in, do you have comments on how an issue like this, obviously becoming more and more public, how it would impact those either wanting to stay or wanting to join?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. I'd mention something that we commented on a bit earlier in the meeting, and that is there is a whole range of accommodations that are available to members and sometimes their families over their lifetime in the forces. And so what's available or of interest to someone who's just joining, someone who's a little bit younger maybe, those quarters that are available to them, and my colleague mentioned the benefits that are provided to them to help them pay for in fact, they don't have to, under certain circumstances, they don't have to pay for the cost of their room and board. So there is an entire accommodations program here that offers different things to different people as they move through their career. So I just don't want to lose sight. I guess I would say, from a recruitment perspective, that folks take the time to talk with us and find out what those options are, because it's not the housing crisis that's affecting people like you, like me, is not necessarily going to show up the same way for everyone who's looking to join the Canadian Armed Forces.
Thank you, Mr. Milano. Mr. Collins, 5 minutes.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. Quick question on the whole issue related to the stock itself in terms of its built form. I served for just over a decade on our municipal nonprofit just prior to my election here. And I know that the most expensive housing to maintain are the singles and semis. And so as an organization, we gravitated away from singles and semis and tried to build more medium and high density housing. Can I ask, through you to the witnesses, what percentage of housing stock managed by the agency is singles, semis, and I guess medium or high density?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. I do not have those statistics available, so I could definitely return that information to the committee. I would, however, comment on the fact that all of the new forms that we have been building, the numbers that I quoted earlier, and for the foreseeable future, will be a more dense built form for very much those reasons, not just for our operations and maintenance, but as well to reduce the departmental custodial load as far as having additional houses. So if I could have one building with 12 houses, 12 apartments in it, it's much better than having 12 singles. So we are on that path at this moment.
Agreed. And I know that because of the location of wings and bases, that in some cases you're faced with infrastructure challenges. I've met with many rural housing providers in my time here in all provinces and territories, and they highlight the fact that it's not just about building the house or the stock in a medium or high density form. There are water, wastewater issues. There might even be other infrastructure like transportation issues. Do you run into those as an agency in terms of trying to accommodate housing needs in areas outside of urban centers?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. Yes, we do, but we have the benefit of being located within Mr. Chambers' group, who is responsible for that municipal infrastructure. So as we've been progressing with the acceleration of our construction program, we have been going for what we would call the low-hanging fruit, in the sense that we are targeting infill development on locations where we already know that the servicing can be provided by the base or wing. And that will give us the time to work with our colleagues in the Real Property Operations Group to put in place the infrastructure to support the remaining of our growth. The perfect example is that the last 2 or 3 years, Edmonton, the RP Ops Group there has been extending the local municipal infrastructure for us to plug in the apartment buildings that we plan to be tendering in the next couple of months and start constructing very soon.
Great to hear. I want to talk about the pandemic. You mentioned that earlier. I know that, looking back to my time on our city housing board, we were substantially impacted by the pandemic. It impacted our ability to get into units and make the necessary repairs. There was reference earlier in terms of the condition of the units. And so when there were provincial, I'll highlight that, provincial lockdowns, our staff had had challenges in terms of getting in those units to make timely repairs. And we were also subject, obviously, to the provincial rent freezes that were extended to all landlords. And so that created, for an organization much like yours that relies on rent revenues to pay for maintenance, it impacted our ability in future years to undertake necessary repairs that had been delayed through the pandemic. So can I get a glimpse, or can the committee get a glimpse in terms of how the agency was impacted in terms of operating under standard operating procedures with the pandemic in place, and what you've done coming out of the pandemic to make up for lost time?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. Throughout the pandemic, as the member mentioned, we did minimize the amount of time that we interfaced with the actual houses as much as possible. We tried not to go into the homes. We only did emergency repairs over the course of that period of time. And we did see the effect in the sense that we weren't getting eyes on all of our assets on a regular basis on a cyclical way as we normally would. And we did see some degree of degradation, hence the numbers that we've seen in our more houses in below average condition. In addition, our houses continue to age irrelevant of the pandemic, and some of the older homes, our condition assessment template, it does account for the aging of the asset. So we did have a very large investment in our housing portfolio back in 2015-16 from the federal government. We built those houses. After 5 years, they fall into a category that is no longer new, but now they're average. And that was a degradation in the condition that is simply the passage of time. And it unfortunately that 5-year window hit during the pandemic. So we were double whammied as far as why our condition dropped. Since the pandemic, we have put the ship back on track. As I mentioned earlier, our below average housing numbers are decreasing, and we are getting back into those houses, and we're catching up on those periods, on those inspections that we missed. And as some of the members mentioned, in our case, the housing portfolio is inspected by our public servants. We do contract those services out, but we have our personal eyes on, and we do take care of those directly. So I'm very confident in the condition of our assets.
Thank you, Mr. Collins. And that brings to conclusion our third round. And I just, on behalf of the committee, wanted to thank you for your participation. It starts our study off on the right foot. Well, I'm open to that if others are. 5:30. We finish at 5:30.
That's our
You want?
scheduled end time originally.
Sorry?
That was our original scheduled end time.
Sure, I'm good with that. So 5:30 is 15 minutes. 15 minutes divided, 5 minutes each party? That's way too much. That's way too much for down there.
That's too much math.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm okay if we do that.
Yeah, 4 minutes each. Okay, Mr. Bazan?
Thank you, and I'll be quick. So, we hear about the stories all the time of people struggling to pay for homes, especially in Esquimalt, Cold Lake, and we're also here in Halifax. I just had a couple that transferred from Shiloh, Canadian Forces, to Halifax, and are living out of a camper because they can't find a home. I know a young guy from my hometown that's serving in Esquimalt, been there for 10 years. Him and his wife live in a one-bedroom apartment with a young family, and to afford that one-bedroom apartment on top of being, 10-year veteran of the Royal Canadian Navy, he has to work a second job to make ends meet. We need more homes, and so either we can be part of the problem or we can be part of the solution. And so when you talk about the Canada Lands Company and you talk about federal assets that we can build more homes on, have you looked at everything from private-public partnerships to getting more expenditures from the government? You talk about $40 million for capitalization. Has that $40 million changed in the last number of years, or has it been a flat set rate? Has the ask gone in that we have to build 7,000 more homes? We want to do that over the next X number of years, so we need this much more in expenditures to get those homes built. If we can't get it from the government coffers, can we do it through private-public partnerships?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. I would say there are 3 lines of effort that we're currently working on right now. There's the Crown housing, so the agency is delivering itself directly for CAF members and their families. There is the capital funding that's made available, public funds that are made available to them that they're implementing. They have a construction program. We've talked about that a little bit already.
Homes a year, that's nothing.
There are a series of administrative practices in place that the agency is using to try and facilitate that matching up of supply and demand. There are a lot of people in communities like Halifax, Kingston. I could list pretty much every country, or every city rather, where there's a military base. There are landlords, landowners who are willing to work with us, work with the agency rather, to help facilitate matching of members to residences. So there's all that sort of practice happening below the radar, so to speak. And then the agency is also working with private sector to figure out exactly under what parameters does the private sector want to partner. And we mentioned the RFIs that had gone out and just recently closed, and analyzing those results and being able to talk further about those. So that's just within the Crown housing piece. On our side, one of our priorities, getting properties back into the communities, so surplus properties, getting them through Canada Lands Companies so they can be reintroduced into the local economy. And so I can talk more about that if you like. Third line of effort is along the lines of what you're discussing. So who, within the federal family, who has the flexibilities, the capability, the authorities to do some of the things that you're talking about?
Have that planned, you said, by the end of this fiscal year, that there should be a plan or a strategy going ahead on how we're going to make that all happen, yes or no?
I did not say that.
Okay, I thought you said, okay. I thought Mr. Trombley did.
I did say that we were going to have a plan in place in accordance with a remit to Parliament at the end of the next fiscal year.
Next
so
fiscal
we are
year.
looking at 18.
Just one last question for General Tattersall. On the BRGS Serva hack, we started receiving information early October that the website was down. Members couldn't get funding, and they were concerned. Then on about October 18th, I was told that it was actually somebody was hacked in. It wasn't just the website down, it was hacked in. I alerted the Ombudsman the very next day. Then you put out on Can4Gen the notice that you knew since September 29th, for 3 weeks that it was a hack. Why didn't we notify members earlier that their personal financial information had been stolen? They could have made, that first 3 weeks, stuff could have gone sideways on them.
Just point out to members, this is a 4-minute round, not a 4-minute round stretched to 5.5, but please, if you could respond very quickly.
Yes, thank you very much for the question, and I'll just reiterate that at this point in time, we don't actually have that confirmation as to what exactly was taken and who may be impacted. That is in progress. The department, and in fact the government, have communicated to members on at least 2 occasions, if my memory serves, as well as through internal forums, the fact that this has happened, and advised members as to what they should do as preliminary measures, i.e. keep a watch on your banks or keep a watch, potentially consider changing your passwords. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bazan. Mr. Collins, 5 minutes, or 4 minutes.
Thanks, Mr. Yep, 4 minutes. Thanks, Mr. Chair. I want to focus on our tenants. The agency is obviously a landlord, and I wonder whether they've conducted any satisfaction surveys in terms of the quality of housing that is provided to CAF members across the country and their opinion regarding the same.
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. We do conduct cyclical customer satisfaction surveys. Just recently received the most recent report. As far as the actual condition of, the satisfaction with the assets are concerned, they're a corollary within that. We don't specifically address those directly when we do our recapitalization, but we have consistently been. So actually, I don't have the results with me, so I won't quote anything.
Well, and I was leading to I had read that 85% of occupants were satisfied with their home. Does that sound accurate?
Comment, but the number is correct. I was going to go with a trend observation, but I wasn't ready to go there, so I apologize.
Okay, thank you for that. And in terms of the constructive criticism, let's call it that comes back to the agency, what are the issues that you need to resolve to get at some of the complaints that come from tenants, whether it's, they're underhoused, maybe they have a family of 3 and they have 2 bedrooms. I know that much of your stock is much like municipal nonprofit housing providers. It was built post-World War II, and so may not be accessible for some that are living with special needs in a unit that's 40 or 50 years old. Can you give us a glimpse in terms of some of the issues that you need to address as part of the surveys with tenants that you've taken?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. So very much our recapitalization program that I referred to earlier is about basically modernizing that portfolio, and that is an observation we do see. These are 1950s stock housing, post-war, very small, large, 3 bedrooms, but still only roughly 1,000 square feet. So we do see that. How do we fit our size 5 foot into this size 2 shoe kind of observations? And we do take that away. But we are now accommodating the larger footprints with our new housing, but we still have a requirement for a smaller number of units. Smaller number of bedrooms per unit. So to accommodate the smaller family sizes. So basically right-sizing the portfolio is a challenge for us because that involves recapitalization or replacement construction when we know we have to grow. So there's a balancing act there that we also have to try to figure out where to have the right bedroom count and right location based on the demography. When we know the demography may change in the next 10 years, 15 years, and our housing solutions are always 20, 30, 40. If you looked at our current stock, 90 years old. So there is a balancing act that we have to accommodate there.
Mr. Chair, on time.
You've got a minute.
Oh, great. Then can I ask about I'm going to follow up on Mr. Bazan's question about the private sector. Can I ask for the bases and wings where we have housing, are there any developments that are mixed with members and those that are in the regular market, so to speak?
Thank you for the question. Are you sorry, if I can get clarification, are you talking about a partnership in existence at this moment in time?
Well, partnership in terms of tenancy or partnership in terms of private sector?
Well, we do have in some locations where we have rented off of the private industry directly on behalf of the member, and I will use Masset as a good example of that, where there is no base. There are no accommodations. And in order to ensure that those people who get posted there are in place, we lock in with local private landlords for those assets. That's the only place where we have that in place. We also do currently partner with, we depend on PSPC in Yellowknife and Iqaluit for those locations.
Thank you, Mr. Collins. Madame Normandine, 4 minutes.
4?
Chair.
Wow. Merci.
Well, thank you very much. We've seen recently in Francophone media a report where a family with 1 child was living in a very small military residents, what didn't suit their needs, and that jeopardised their capacity to have another child. And the couple called into question whether the serviceman should in fact change careers and become a civilian. So when it comes to relocations or reposting, should we not only take into account the current situation of military families, but what their future needs might be in the next 2 or 3 years? Is that something that's factored in? And if it isn't, should it be?
Merci pour la question.
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chairperson. When a CAF member agrees to one of our housing units, they have in their minds what they think might be necessary when it comes to taking possession of that living accommodation. Now, obviously, families change, they grow sometimes, and at some point, as I said earlier, the the size 10 shoe doesn't fit the size 12 shoe. So there are other available options in the portfolio that we have at our disposal. But the problem is that other people also have their particular needs. And so it's a balancing act. As I said, it's very difficult to strike a balance. Now, the example that you're citing is one that I'm acutely familiar with. If I come back to what I was saying earlier about top priority 1 and priority 2, well, this is a second priority item. Some people don't have anything. This is a matter of preference. So we have to accommodate those priority 1 cases first, and when that's done, then we can busy ourselves with the priority 2 cases. But occupants also have to think about their own futures. We can't predict everything, and as their family situation does evolve, they have to think about particular personal choices that they make in their lives that need to match up with their new realities. Well, just to push back on that, a serviceman or woman says, well, I have 1 child, but in the upcoming years I might like to have a second or a third child. Could they at that point say, in 2 years' time, I will need a housing unit with an additional room rather than having to move at the last minute or have their needs not met at that point? Thank you very much for the question. At this stage, I would say, in response to your question, no. Now, let's say we have 11,600 houses and 10,000 of those living accommodations are occupied. Well, it's a checker game, if you will, and a balancing act in a sense. So just because you might want to have a family doesn't necessarily mean that you will have a family. So it's a bit unrealistic to expect us to manage things in such a forward-looking manner, given that we're already meeting undue levels of pressure.
You're happy to donate it to Ms. Matz. Thank you. 4 minutes and 29 seconds.
I'll take it. I wanted to go back to the conversation we were having about BGRS. We've gone over the issues in terms of the hack and what that breach caused to members. But it's my understanding this was the only the latest issues with that contract, and in fact, the RCMP had been on contract with the same company for relocation services, had repeated issues with BGRS. And that actually led them to bring those relocation services back in-house. So could you tell the committee what analysis was done on whether to end the contract, and then why was it chosen after all of these issues with all of that history from RCMP as well, why D&D would then choose to retender that contract and renegotiate that contract as opposed to doing what RCMP had done and bring it in-house?
Thank you very much for the question. I'll simply say that we have outsourced this service since approximately 1998, which means that we have almost 23 plus years of a contracted service. That means that both the resources, the knowledge and the ability to bring that back in-house and deliver that support to members doesn't exist. But furthermore, what I would indicate to you is perhaps it's a bit of a myth to think that we could deliver the same scale of services that we currently receive from that company. And I'll explain it this way. Currently, that company operates extended hours for us to cover off both coasts of Canada, as well as the fact that we have members that need services out CAN. It offers an email response within a certain period of time. It will respond and process transactions over the weekend. Our military members, while I realize that we use the phrase that we are 24/7, 365, that does not translate, particularly given our current personnel shortages, to us being able to provide that same service wherein a member could expect that they could walk in at 7 in the morning and see someone to ask their questions, whether they could send an email in the evening and expect within a period of time to get a reply, or that they would have transactions processed over the weekend. That's simply not feasible. So we are retendering the contract with the understanding that there needs to be improvements to it, but we're also looking internally at how can we better bridge the understanding of our members to the benefits and perhaps better enable them to be able to have that dialogue with the service provider about what their benefits are. And I'm speaking specifically, can we leverage generative AI as a tool to be able to provide sort of a benefits advisor to say to you, okay, here's what you should ask of BGRS specifically, because there's an aspect of this that also goes back on to the members to understand what are their benefits, what are they intending to do, so that BGRS can provide them the correct service. Thank you for the question.
You're talking about AI providing services now that humans normally would. That's dangerous, I would suggest, and we've certainly seen that backfire in terms of Veterans Affairs, but I digress. I would also argue that those complaints have been happening for pretty much the entire time that the contract has been in view. So one would argue that if you're going to say that you've had this long-standing contract, that you would also want to reestablish or review all of those complaints as well and take that into account. I would also like to know if you could file with this committee what the cost of that contract was and what we're looking at paying into the future. Thank you.
So, Mr. Chair, a couple of things. First and foremost, let me reassure you that what I was not proposing by my comment about generative AI was in any way or shape to say that now that member would actually talk to this and get services in terms of, here's your benefit that will pay you this amount. What I was referring to is that our policies are very detailed. It can be difficult at times to understand, and much like I use Google to get an answer to help me inform myself before I have a discussion, that was not what my proposal was, so my apologies if I misled you. With respect to the contract, I can certainly provide you the costs of the contract that we have currently. What I obviously cannot provide you is the cost of a contract that, in fact, we're still in the request for proposal phase. We haven't actually settled or selected who the next contractor will be. So unfortunately, I can't provide you specific costs.
Thank you, Ms. Madison. And because it's not well known that I'm a warm and generous chair, Ms. Gallant, she was jumping up and down and wishing to ask a very short question, please.
So with respect to Brookfield, it was reported to me about the hack on October 5th. The hack had been in progress. Nobody was able to reach Brookfield for 2 weeks before that. It was in the news as of around October 20th. My question is for military contractors, what is the required timeline within which a contractor is required to advise the military that they have been hacked?
So, Mr. Chair, I can't specifically give you that time frame, but what I would like to reiterate for the members of the committee is the fact that this data breach was worldwide for CERVA, and it impacts them around the world in addition to specifically CERVA Canada and BGRS. I cannot give you a time frame as to how much, did they have 10 hours, did they have 24? I'm sorry, I'm not able to provide that response to you at this time.
Thank you, all of you, for staying with us. Just before I gavel this to an end, in my riding is a large college, 25,000 students, and of course they have housing issues, really difficult housing issues, and they entered into a pretty innovative public-private partnership. And I'm just curious as to whether there's any structural impediment to the military or how the military service for housing, whether there's any structural impediment to entering into a significant public-private partnership to address this need, because as I listen to the testimony, we'll be back here next year, and we'll be back here the year after that, and the year after that. So is that at all realistic?
Mr. Chair, thank you for the question. It really does depend on the details. In our case, the minister is empowered through the National Defense Act and the Federal Real Property and Immovables Act to hold real property for the purposes of the defense mandate. And so there are some constraints that pop up as a result of that on potential public-private partnerships. But even so, details matter, and so there are some flexibilities there. I think where we're focusing our energy is working with partners like Canada Lands Company and potentially Public Services and Procurement Canada, who have commercial authorities that would allow them more easily to enter into those sorts of arrangements on our behalf. So I would say there are possibilities. We are actively looking at them, and I certainly hope that we're not back here next year having the same conversation.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. Both the university and the college have entered into public-private partnerships, and it's alleviating a housing crisis, but it's by no means the end all. But anyways, on that note, thank you very much for your presence here and your patience, and we appreciate your contributions to this study. Meeting adjourned.